Dr. Thomson, in speaking of the origins of democracy in the United States, you went way back to the Federalist Papers and to Thomas Jefferson. And I just would like to ask you regarding the use of the filibuster today, in which a minority of the members of the United States Senate can effectively stop action by a majority. To what extent do you think that that impairs and casts questions on the actual operations of democracy?
Well, that would be an opinion. I try to be factual. But for the first thing to say is the filibuster has been around a very long time, and it also once, as I understand it, once existed in the House, but in changes of House rules in the 19th century, it was eliminated, which tells you something, and that these are rules. They're not laws. They were determined by the members, and they can change them. We know that the filibuster rule was changed, I think it was in the late 70s, I'm not quite sure, from the 2/3 rule to the 60 vote rule. So clearly it requires that the Senate puts the Senate in the driver's seat, especially when we have this, particularly when we have this divided government like this. I think we're noticing the filibuster more now. The other thing to say is that the procedural, it's now quite easy to make a filibuster. It's a matter of filing a motion that you intend to filibuster, and that then you don't actually have to do it. So you don't have to go to the floor and start reading the Washington, D.C. telephone books and so forth. You have to take the floor and talk out the issue. There are some people who have observed maybe the right thing to do is to get rid of the ease of simply filing the motion and require that the party that wants to have a filibuster must mount the filibuster, in which case, of course, it will look very bad to everybody. Those of us who are old enough to remember when people stood there 24 hours a day. But still, I mean, it has a very old tradition. It goes back to the Roman Empire. I mean, they used to do that in the forum, talk out, try to hold the floor until the sun went down. So that was a standard practice. So it's not new in this, but it would be maybe if you had to actually do it, there wouldn't be many, and they'd be saved for a few issues.
Mr. Thomson, I was very interested in your data of the changes of the conservative voting patterns. And there's been some discussion in Ohio, at least, which is still a fairly competitive state, obviously, as an overall state, about the fact that redistricting, when controlled by party organizations, has tended to lump districts, particularly for Congress and sometimes for state, House and Senate, actually, into very predictable patterns. One party's going to dominate each district, and you don't have as many competitive districts as we used to have. Do you think a way to get more competitive districts would change this dynamic at all, or are the demographic and other trends such that it wouldn't have much effect?
That's a good question, and I do spend a little time in the paper on this topic, which comes to mind. The answer is, sadly, nationwide, it won't have much of an effect because this geographic sorting point that I made as the one of the two reasons for the growing polarization is, in effect, the people have gerrymandered themselves. And so you can, at the margin, now maybe in a state like Ohio, I'm making a nationwide point here, maybe there may be places where these things are, you will gain a little bit, and it may matter a lot for one or two states where it could make a big difference. But basically, the work on this, which I think is very good, it has very little effect, gerrymandering. Sadly, that's not a solution. Undoing gerrymandering.
Dr. Thomson, over the years, we have had a number of third-party movements in this country. I could think of the Dixiecrats and the John Anderson Party at one time, and the Ross Perot movement a few years ago, none of which have come to anything. In other countries, multi-party systems are much more abundant, as demonstrated very recently by the election in the UK. Do you see any possibility that that sometime in the next 10 to 20 years we might have additional parties emerging, as perhaps exemplified by the Tea Party movement now? Or is the two-party movement so firm-wired in this country that this is extremely unlikely ever to happen?
Well, 20 years, given these trends that I showed you here, you could imagine that there might enough anger might be generated, in particular among independent voters, who, as I explained, by the loss of the moderates, are basically not represented any longer. That something might happen with the independent voters. But there are a lot of obstacles to that. The first one is that they're not of one mind. You can have an independent voter who's economically conservative and socially liberal. You can have an economic voter who's economically liberal and socially conservative. So they're not going to, they're not going to support the same person. So that's the first problem. The second thing is the voting rules in the United States are like in the UK, first past the post. In other words, that means that the candidate with the largest plurality of votes wins. It doesn't have to be the most votes. The largest plurality of votes wins in a geographic area. In the presidential elections for states, for senator states, for the congressional districts. And those tend to squeeze out, there's been plenty of studies, those tend to squeeze out third parties. The Liberal Democrats are interesting in the UK, but they're quite regional. If you look at the map at how so they do well in some regions, but they don't do well everywhere. So you might get some of that. Maybe you'll get some regionalization. That could be a possibility. But I think on the whole, a combination of the fact that you can't characterize independents very carefully, easily. You can't have a candidate that will appeal to all of them, because they're a substantial number of people. They're roughly equal to the two parties. And then there's the fact of election rules, which make it difficult to mount third-party challenges.
Yes, it seems to me that polarization in the parties is carried on by the old guard, the guys who have been there for a while. And so I wondered if we had term limits on Congress. So you would spend 12 years there, and then you couldn't be there anymore. Would that stop or reduce the polarization we now have?
Well, I don't. Actually, the data don't support the point. I'm sorry to say. The data are that it's actually the new people who are more likely to be, because they're replacing. They've been replacing people more toward the center. So some of those people I reeled off, those 5 names on the left side of the Republican Party in the Senate, those people mainly are people who've been there a while. A couple of them only a couple terms, but they lost. But the other 3 have been there a long time. So the polarization is not coming from in terms of time. That's not answering. Question about term limits. That's another issue, and I don't have a study on that. And I think that's so I'll stay out of that particular fight. But I don't think the fact is correct that it's the old folks doing this. They're the leaders, of course. The ones who are been there a long time are the leaders, and we see them more. But that doesn't mean they're the ones who are driving the process.